And welcome back to the WIRE's fall meeting. I am pleased today to introduce the first panel of the day on interconnection. Again, I covered why we're so excited to talk about interconnection a little bit in my opening remarks, but really a lot of exciting news, both at FERC with their proposed rulemaking and at DOE with their I2X process. Just a lot going on, generational changes in how we connect generation to the transmission and distribution network. I'm just really excited for the panelists today, and we'll introduce Amanda Connor, who's the WIRE's Vice President, who's going to be moderating this panel to introduce everybody and the rest of the panel. So thank you, Amanda.
Thank you. This is working good because I couldn't find an on button. So thanks everyone for joining. I think this panel is highly relevant for most of us in this room. So excited to see what our panelists have to say about it and hear your questions on the subject. So I did want to introduce the panel here, and we're talking about integration issues for transmission and particularly the interconnection notice of proposed rulemaking. So immediately to my left here, I have Cynthia Bothwell, who's the Grid Integration Engineer for Wind Energy Technology with the Department of Energy. And then we have Tristan Kessler, who's an economist with the FERC Office of Energy Policy and Innovation. And finally, we have Scott Wright, who's the Executive Director of Resource Adequacy and Resource Utilization with MISO. So if it's okay with you, Cynthia, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you for some opening comments on this important issue for us.
Okay, so first I'm going to put interconnection into context by talking through some of the Biden administration goals and how this is going to really exacerbate interconnection today. So, you know, it's expected that clean energy is going to improve jobs and improve our energy independence. And to get there, the Biden administration has set goals for the electricity sector to be carbon-free by 2035 and for the whole energy sector to be carbon neutral by 2050. So those are, you know, some might say lofty goals and some may say that's not quick enough and we need it faster. But to put that in context into the renewable energy sectors and how that translates out to the interconnection process. Right now we're about at 40 megawatts a day of solar integration, and that's expected to need to ramp up to 160 megawatts per day of interconnections of new solar. On the wind side, we've been developing wind since the 1990s, 30 plus years, and we have this phrase in our office, 5 times by 35. So 5 times of what is been implemented over the last 30 years will be on the grid in the next 13 years. So by 2035. So huge increases in renewable energy to meet those goals. On the offshore wind side that I'm also working on, the Biden administration has goals of 30 gigawatts by 2030, and that should pave the way to 110 gigawatts by 2050. So again, hitting land and sea for renewable integration. And so how does that all fit into the interconnection process? Right now, the interconnection queues, if you are familiar with those, have more generation in queue than are in operation on the grid today. So again, a huge volume. So how are we going to process all that volume? So far the states and utilities have done a good job of getting projects through the queue to meet state goals, but again, to get this ramp up of 4 times solar per day and 5 times of wind, you know, over the next few years is just huge. And so if you haven't looked at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab's queued up reports, they do a good job of explaining the queues and issues with that, so I encourage you to look through that. So what we work on is not just the interconnection part of it, but DOE is also monitoring the operations of these, like as FERC has mentioned, reliability is key. So we can't integrate all this renewables without also considering those reliability factors. And if you've followed some of the NERC reports and findings of events, you know, renewables have contributed in a negative way to some of those events. And so it's important for us to work on that at DOE, improving models, tools, data. Those are all aspects of what we're working on. And then also training. We don't have enough workforce to run the models and tools. We need to improve them, but we also need to increase a workforce that knows how to run those tools, to get studies through the interconnection process. And the studies are more complex, and instead of just load flow or power flow analysis, we now have to do stability analysis because of the impacts of the renewables on the grid. So it's very important to hit those aspects. And we've been encouraged by seeing a lot of innovation by different utilities, by different states, by different ISOs, but that needs to be distributed more broadly. So some of these, all these reasons are why we set up the Interconnection Innovation Exchange, or I2X, which I'll explain a little bit more later. But I wanted to also tell you some of the other aspects of, before I get to that good stuff, I wanted to go over a couple more aspects of what my office, the Wind Energy Technologies Office, is working on with respect to the grid activities. So one is grid enhancing technologies, specifically dynamic line ratings and doing demonstration projects to help demonstrate that. But I know Jay Casberry is going to be talking about that in the second panel, so I'm not going to talk about that right now, but our office does support that. We're also working heavily with offshore wind and HVDC technologies for transmission. And so those two are, to me, working together, because to integrate a lot of offshore wind, we expect to need to use HVDC technologies as we're getting farther from shore, and it becomes cost effective. So there's a lot of technology innovation that needs to take place there. Our office announced last week a notice of intent to fund projects on HVDC, specifically around standards and standardization. We talked about that again. The FERC talked about that and talked about NERC standards, but we think the standards don't fully capture everything associated with offshore wind and HVDC, so we're trying to implement that. Working with multi-terminal HVDC and improving protection and controls around that. And then again, workforce training and education. So we have to do that. So that's kind of both offshore wind development and the HVDC. Then I'll get on to the I2X program. So there's 4 main pillars associated with that. 1, stakeholder engagement. 2, data analysis and metrics building. 3, a roadmap, and 4, more of technical assistance. So let's dig into each of those components. First, the stakeholder engagement platform is, as I said, we see a lot of innovation in pockets, and we want to help share that knowledge and put people together, put utilities together, put states together, and what can they learn from each other, and so that each entity can make their own informed decisions using knowledge they've gained from others. So that's some of the aspects. And so we're starting some working groups associated with that too. We're going to launch our first one next week, which is on energy equity and justice. But we have other ones planned for 1547 compliance and adoption, 2800 compliance and adoption, and best practices around that. Hosting capacity studies, which might be new to the transmission sector, but they've done it more broadly on the distribution sector. But it's essentially showing interconnection entities where there's actually capacity on the system so that they can integrate. And then similar to that is data transparency and working through proprietary or confidential information, critical infrastructure information, and how can we best give out information so that people can understand the system better and interconnect better or faster with this better information. And then cost allocation, which is everyone's favorite hot topic. So we, as my colleagues say, we love messy, complex, challenging problems. And so again, it's just to start that conversation and put people together and try to figure out those things. Data analytics and metrics, the second pillar is, I guess I should take a step back and say the Interconnection Innovation Exchange, I2X, is combined between our office, the wind office, and the solar office. Solar office kind of was the big starter, but we were definitely on board for that. But we've engaged 3 national labs to also support us on that, Pacific Northwest National Lab, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And so Lawrence Berkeley is doing a lot of our analytics, as I mentioned earlier, and trying to look at the Q data and find out, what's the holdup and try to inform good decisions. So we've supported the FERC and the rulemaking they're doing through this data analysis, and also publishing this data so that other stakeholders to those processes could use that data. But another part of that then is setting metrics. So once we've looked at all the data, how can we use that to figure out what needs to change and can help facilitate faster interconnection processes. The next is a strategic roadmap that's been started and should be finished next year, and that will inform where we go next with the I2X program. So the pillars I say now might not be going forward. We may expand and go in different directions as we see what comes out of the roadmap. And to support that, we've had a number of workshops. We go to conferences such as this and others in the renewable realm to find out what each of the stakeholders is interested in and wants to see and what their ideas are for innovating the interconnection process. And lastly, the pillar is technical assistance, and so we're doing a lot in that realm. We've already been offering office hours, like on Friday, for people to call in or set up an appointment to talk to some of our experts, whether it's within the DOE or within the national labs that support us in this program. And we found out a lot of different information that's helping support the roadmap, and then also we can point these parties to some good information when they're stuck in their processes. So we're trying to move that forward. We're also going to be offering training like EMT model training so that we can expand workforce through that. And we also hope to set up we call like sandboxes for regulators to test new ideas so that they can try to innovate in a safe space and figure out how that's going to work before implementing it more broadly. So one example is like a connect and manage process, which would be more on the distribution system, and it's kind of similar to what we just talked about in the ERIS process that is part of FERC, where you just connect, you don't have full network rights, and you can be curtailed if needed, but that would ensure quick interconnection of these resources. But then to maintain the reliability, you have to be able to operate them in a manner to preserve system reliability. So that's one thing that we've been talking about. So I'm probably using up my time.
No, I actually really appreciate it, and I had some questions and you answered all of them, so I'm not going to ask them.
Better time for some new questions.
Well, I think that, most of us in this room, we deal frequently with FERC, obviously. We deal frequently with the RTOs, but we don't hear directly from DOE as much. And that's why I wanted you to go first on the panel, because, there are a lot of things you mentioned that I didn't know were out there. The sandbox, I think, is very interesting. Obviously, you all have thought about this a lot, and there are still a lot of challenges with generator interconnection, even I think with this NOPR. So it's great to hear about all the things that you've been doing to really think about it and problem solve.
Yeah, so some of the tensions we've heard from our stakeholders are, or different parties that we've talked to, is that we have a lot of speculative projects in the queue. And, but there's reasons for that, because they don't have the data and the information they need to make informed decisions on where to put in an interconnection request. So there's a problem based on another problem. And so we're trying to unwind that and figure out how can we make that data more available, and what data, and do we need it all? Do we need all these studies? In some cases we do, we definitely do, but in some cases maybe the length of the studies is slowing things down. So just trying to find that right balance of how to do that, and then how to make the whole process faster. So
agree.
Get that high volume through
Yes,
there.
a lot of balance going on.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to turn to Tristan next, and I think we'll have each of the panelists give an intro and background, and then I'll ask some questions, and then turn it over to the audience to ask some questions. So Tristan?
Sure.
I don't know. Mine was already on. You want this one?
Sure. Switch. Go ahead. You get the bump. Good morning, everyone. Okay, that works great. My name's Tristan Kessler. I'm here from the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation. And before I say anything else, let me just give my standard disclaimer that all the words I say are my own. I only represent myself. I don't represent anyone else on staff or a commissioner. Certainly not all 5 commissioners at once. That would be quite the feat. Words I say are my words. They're not replaced by the legal words in the NOPR document. That is the key document that we're referring to here. And obviously I can't talk about any open, contested cases in front of the Commission for ex parte concerns. So with that being said, I'm excited to geek out about interconnection with you all here. I think, we've proposed a NOPR, and just from a high level, the reason I don't need to harp on the need for reform here with this audience. I think it's pretty obvious to everyone that the interconnection queues are generally pretty backlogged. I'm sure we'll talk a bit about MISO's recent queue that closed something like, in September, something like 1,000 projects and 175,000 megawatts, something like that. So that's a month ago. So I'm excited to be at your fall 2032 panel to talk about interconnection issues as well. So what we're trying to do from a high level in this NOPR is that we recognize a problem that there's a lot of projects in the queue, right? And that's being driven by a lot of things. Some things which we can control, FERC can control, and some things the Commission can't really control. But we're seeing a lot of projects that might not reach commercial operation. And the problem, of course, with this high volume of projects is that the way they're studied, the projects eventually one project is going to get hit with a high network upgrade cost. It's going to be the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, and that project is going to say, no way I'm paying that, and withdrawals. And when you have these withdrawals, they create cascading of these studies, especially withdrawals late stage in the process. So we recognize this dynamic is creating problems, and at a high level, we're trying to change that dynamic through a series of proposed reforms in this NOPR. And the general idea there is that we're trying to encourage customers to be more ready, more viable. We're going to require more from the interconnection customer in terms of site control requirements, in terms of study deposits, in terms of withdrawals, with the idea being there that the projects that enter the queue are more likely to proceed to commercial operation. We won't lead to these cascading of these studies. So how are we going to accomplish that? Just at a high level, we have a suite of 13 proposed reforms, and we see these proposals is really sort of best practices. A lot of these proposals are things that other transmission providers have come to us and proposed and we've accepted. They're things we've heard through outreach, things we've heard through technical conferences. So we really see these as a suite of best practices that we're trying to expand. This is a proposal to revise the pro forma documents. Obviously, some transmission providers have moved past that in terms of their interconnection process. But in terms of altering the pro forma, we see these as best practices that we want to distribute across our jurisdiction. So we have sort of 13, like I said, 13 proposals, 3 big categories, one of which is implementing a cluster process, a first ready, first served cluster study process. We see as a more efficient way of managing a queue. A lot of transmission providers currently are doing that cluster process, but not everywhere. And as part of that reform, we have a couple reforms to increase information access early in the process. Part of the problem is that developers have to participate in this process to know the costs of their network upgrades with certainty. And those network upgrade costs are becoming an increasingly large input share of their project. So they have to participate in this process to find out what their costs are. So to the extent that we can provide information earlier in the process, that should help them make more informed decisions and keep some of these less ready projects out of the queue. We also proposed a few reforms to increase the speed of processing the interconnection queue. We proposed to eliminate the reasonable effort standard for processing interconnection studies, replace it with firm deadlines and financial penalties for missing those deadlines. I'm sure we'll talk about that more. I'm sure reforms to address the affected systems process. So we've heard from a lot of people, with these big seams now, affected systems are becoming an issue, becoming a cause of delay in the queues. So we're proposing sort of standard procedure, some standard agreements, and the ERS modeling standard, which we can talk more about for sure. And then finally, there's proposals to incorporate some advanced technologies into the interconnection process, ways to basically better incorporate storage, some process improvements, co-location, material modification, some of the sort of weedy details of incorporating storage in the interconnection process. Also studying advanced transmission technologies, requiring transmission providers to at least look at some of these advanced transmission technologies with the hope that they're sort of less cost solutions than a big blind network upgrade. And then finally, rules around IBRs in terms of submitting the right models, providing ride-through requirements to ensure reliability. Eric talked a lot about the necessity there of reliability, so that's an aspect of our proposal that we're moving forward with. So I'll sort of pause there and happy to talk about the details of specific reforms when we get to them.
I can't believe you did that all without any notes.
I've done it like 20 times, so.
All right, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Great. This thing's working good. Great. Thanks. My name's Scott Wright. Glad to be here. I'm from MISO. I look over our resource planning group. This is a new role for me, about 6 months. I've been at MISO for a while, and mostly in market development, market reforms, and strategic planning. Excited to have the interconnection team as one of my group, but also I have resource adequacy. So it's been an interesting year for us. For sure, we probably had more headlines this year in MISO related to resource adequacy and the threat of outages than we have in the last 5 years combined. And we did not have rolling blackouts this summer, which is a very great thing. But just a lot of time on educating and discussing with folks about how these issues interrelate with one another. So it was really hard for me to develop my comments today without kind of lifting up and seeing those interrelations. And I was encouraged by the keynote this morning from FERC also doing the exact same thing. So with my group, we've put the group together to look at the life cycle of resources from, I say, sort of a conception, which would be interconnection agreement application or generation interconnect application through pregnancy. Let's go through the process and see if we can get to an actual interconnection agreement. And then we have the coming online, getting registered MISO's models, so birth, coming in as a resource that's functioning in the market. And then we have the teenage and adult years where these resources are performing. And we can come to understand what they really can do for their reliability contribution to the grid. And then finally, we have that sunset phase where resources may want to suspend or retire. And so that whole cycle is all sort of the purview of my team. And I've only been in this 6 months, but we're seeing all kinds of interconnections and relationships across all of those parts of the cycle. And I can talk about some of those this morning. So one thing I wanted to say is that, as mentioned earlier, the risk profile of the grid is changing significantly. This is a profile becoming more characterized by uncertainty and variability. That's always been part of managing the grid, but we really have a new risk signature that's taking over the operation. And it's coming faster than anybody thought it would. And so all of our thoughts and plans at MISO have had to be reprioritized and changed. So we published a roadmap last year that set forth a lot of those areas of emphasis. Those things include long-range transmission planning. Those things include market redefinition. It includes operations of the future. We've got to make progress on all of these fronts to really meet the risk challenge that we see facing the region. So, thoughts on interconnection? A phrase that came to mind as I was preparing was, if you build it, they will come. It's a movie that warms the hearts of many, a quote from that. And I think that's, to the extent, partly true with the Q. We've had many years of reforms going back over a decade, many of which I had nothing to do with, and have been great work to make the Q more responsive. It's really the turnstile, right? The entrance into the resource family. So we want that turnstile to be well greased. We want it to be understood how you get in. We want you to know about the risks once you get in there, about coming out in terms of cost and exposure. And we really want it to be wide. And our most recent Q application process showed that with 950 plus applications and 170 plus gigawatts of applications. Now we know before those turn into real study prospects, there'll be a lot of changes there, and we'll lose probably 10 to 30% of those as we have in the past. But that's a significant volume. It represents 150% of our peak load. So we also know that a lot of these resources, if things go well, will not get built. We're probably counting on 80 to 85% of the resources in the queue not to be built. Based on history, will that change with the future? I don't know. It's a very competitive market. The developers of these projects are doing everything they can to manage returns and get competitive PPAs, win business against others, and cost, transmission upgrade costs, everything makes a difference to their bottom line. So this is very important because MISO has been, I think, entered into the cusp of a serious resource adequacy problem in our region. And it all came to light this spring with our planning resource auction where we couldn't meet our PRMR through our capacity auction. We were shy just a tiny little bit, 1% on the requirement, just shy that much. But with our pricing formula, being fairly binary, it sent the capacity prices through the roof and to our max tariff allowed value. So a big thing that came up was, well, we obviously have a resource adequacy problem in MISO. If you would just fix the queue, wouldn't that solve everything? Which I think is a really fair question, because there are a lot of projects in the queue and we always have to keep doing these reforms. But what we've really I think our answer to that is we don't think the queue is a resource adequacy problem in MISO. We are signing interconnect agreements, new capacities getting installed every year, but there's some other things that relate to it that are also driving that, and I'll comment on that in a little bit. So we're very encouraged with the FERC NOPR and realize these issues do span the entire United States and all of the markets and grids, and everyone has a different state of evolution, working with their constituencies, their stakeholders, their members. For us, we really do believe the first ready, first serve is the way to go, and we made reforms to do that in our market. Anything to do to help remove the speculation from the queue. Maybe it has to be speculative up front, but anything you can do after that to address that risk and get it out so the study focus can be on the folks, the higher certainty projects and the folks that are willing to put more risk and commitment into their projects. We really feel, and we mentioned a lot of comments, in our NOPR related to effective system studies. That's a big theme for us. Really, we need to get that first ready, first serve entirely operating on affected system studies, not just within a single RTO. And so we don't have all the answers of how to do that, but we're taking steps. So we've got a couple things we've worked up with one of our large SEAM neighbors, SPP, related to how we can install those principles. So first ready, first serve can take precedence in affected system studies over just first in, first out sort of concepts. And we also have a joint targeted interconnection queue where we're looking at ways of fundamentally enabling more resources by building backbone transmission projects. And so that's a very exciting thing for us. And we think that project could potentially enable 30 gigawatts or so of renewables that would straddle the SPP MISO seam. And these transmission investments could enable them to play in both markets. So that's a journey. It's an exploration. We don't have all the answers. We're trying to get the questions right. Do we have the right questions? And we're asking for stakeholder engagement and ideas as we go through that, and hopefully we'll get our first tranche of those projects in play that can be quite meaningful to both regions. So back to some of the concepts related to how things connect. We've been successful in a long-range transmission plan. We call it Tranche 1. Enormous amount of work, an enormous amount of engagement, a lot of ideas, and we've put together a portfolio of around $10 billion that we think in 18 or so projects includes a competitive transmission access angle in there as well. And we're looking forward to doing a lot more of that. Project just in itself, the first tranche, we think could support 50 gigawatts of new resources. So there you see the power of having to work all the angles, the transmission angle, not just the queue intake turnstile process, but what are you doing, the projects that came into that queue that we just referenced, that's the transmission grid that we will be doing our studies against. Is that transformed through Tranche 1? So that's a huge benefit. So we're looking forward to leveraging those things. Do we wish it could have happened several years ago? Sure, but it's happening now, and we're looking forward to Tranche 2 of long-range transmission investment. I've mentioned a couple of things. MISO is very committed, and our stakeholders are committed to clean energy. I'd say we're supporting our stakeholders in their goals to that regard. We've got most of the large load-serving entities in MISO have pretty aggressive clean energy goals. Those goals keep getting more aggressive, whether it's 80% or 100%, whether it's 2040 or 2035 or 2030. Everyone keeps making their goals, it appears, more aggressive. A part of that comes with more aggressive assumptions of what they want to build. So there's the queue with all the clean energy resources, but it's also more aggressive of what they want to retire. And there's a question earlier on this about retirements. And we think this is a very significant issue. We see more press releases related to what folks want to retire and how they want to retire it sooner than we do to even maybe building new resources at times. This has been a big theme this year, and so for us not meeting our plan and reserve margin requirement, we've noted the installed capacity at MISO has done this, and the accredited value of capacity at MISO has done this. So we're creating a gap. And so it's great we're building these new resources, but the accredited value is quite low. And we say, well, accredited value, is that some kind of RTO, technical term for something that's not very useful? No, it's very useful. The accredited value is what we count on for the resource for its reliability contribution. And so we have changed from an industry where you could serve the summer peak, you could probably carry the rest of the year, you got to be on your game, things can happen. To now, there's a lot more seasonal risk that's very dynamic. We've seen the references to extreme weather. Those are extreme, and as was commented earlier, they're not also just rare. They're more frequent. And so we're adopting a seasonal capacity construct. We need these resources to come in and decide what seasons they want to be the best at. Maybe they don't want to have must-offer obligations in all seasons. Maybe they're not well suited to all seasons. We're trying to provide that flexibility, but also recognizing the needs vary across the year. The other thing we've noticed is that with the accelerated retirements, we're losing a lot of stuff that just used to be there in terms of other reliability attributes. And so we have turned up our dialogue and our plans, and we're changing our priorities to take up this issue of these reliability attributes. And these attributes are things like, availability when the grid is most distressed. Not just general availability on an average basis across the year or season. So we've made a lot of reforms to accreditation, and we have others in motion. The other thing we're doing is looking at, you can always make a lot of lists of attributes. We've signaled 4 or 5. Response time, ramp up capability is very valuable. And we've been talking about fuel assurance. That's a very important energy consideration. Lastly, we're talking about long duration output. It's one thing to serve a peak hour of a summer and cover the year. It's another thing to serve a few peak hours or maybe a day of a season. It's another to be able to serve 3 to 5 days of pretty extreme conditions and know that you've got all the juice you need to cover those situations. So we're taking a broader look at what we really need on the grid. The risk profile is changing. The risk appetite is not. Everybody wants assumed power all of the time, on command, in every season and under every condition. And we're translating our economy through electrification to put much more on the electric grid that drives our society, both with cars, space heating, etc. So all this is going to be even more important. So these are the pieces that we're going to be using. We're hoping it'll influence what comes into the queue, and we're hoping it'll influence what folks say, I'm going to pay up for transmission upgrades or what have you, that comes out of the queue in terms of interconnection agreements. So we feel like we've really got a transition risk here to get the clean energy state everybody wants to go to, and we've got to change some of our priorities, change some of our constructs, whether it's resource adequacy or energy markets, and really get after all this.
Great, thanks, Scott. I'm actually something you said piqued my curiosity on the capacity accreditation issues. Has MISO been, not necessarily coordinating, but conferring with other RTOs as to how to put that puzzle together with intermittent resources and the less than 24/7 availability? I'm just curious because this is an issue across the country. How we're really going to do this when you have these variable resources instead of coal and gas all the time?
Sure, yeah, we're up to our elbows in this. I know there's 1 or 2 stakeholders in the room. I always give my condolences to them. I saw Jeff over here earlier. It's like, I apologize in advance. We're making everyone's heads explode in terms of these discussions of how we should accredit resources. We've filed reforms, and FERC has approved, and we're implementing reforms right now for thermal resources. And the way we've accredited resources in this industry is a legacy entirely inadequate process that we've used, using generalized outage rates averaged across the year. And so we've put in reforms that really look at the thermal fleet. So let's get our coal, let's get our gas, let's get our nuclear, and see who shows up when the grid is in its most dire circumstances. That's who gets the highest share of accredited capacity value. So you may be available 70% of the time, 80% of the time, 60% of the time, but if you're never there when we really need you, that's interesting, but it's not really helpful. So we've made designs to that effect. So we call these resource adequacy hours, and it's involved, there's no perfect accreditation design for sure. There are a lot of different paths. We've put together a construct we think makes sense for thermal, but everyone asks, so what are you going to do on non-thermal, and can the same principles apply? we think the same principles can apply for sure, and that they should, and that these accreditation methods should be fairly agnostic to fuel type. That said, there are some really unique things about the non-thermal. They are extremely highly correlated. When things go, when they go well, it's all weather dependent, and they're weather dependent the same. We've seen events in MISO, even though we have a lot of geographic diversity, where we've seen wind lulls across the entire region just a few years ago, where the wind output was actually negative. There was no wind output anywhere in MISO. In fact, they were drawing power because of auxiliary station needs. This was in the heat of winter, so to speak, when you think wind would be at its highest output. And folks go, well, that's an exception. You need to deal with that. You don't plan around that. Then came Uri. A very sustained low wind output for a very long period of time. Not 4 hours, not 8 hours, not 24 hours, not 48 hours. It was like 5 to 10 days of a really low wind output across many RTOs. So we're trying to figure out what to do on non-thermal accreditation that is complementary to what we did on thermal accreditation, but also accounts for some of the unique aspects of these resources. So we have given some elements that we're going to be looking in our design at RE hours and what renewables do during those hours. Importantly, what we do before is we use probabilistic studies, and we come up with an average value, and then we look at individual units and look at the performance in gross peak. The changing risk of the grid is gross peak is very interesting and very important, but net peak is where the action's at. And so we've got to have accreditation that links at net peak, and that's where the RE hours, et cetera, come into play. So hopefully in the next 30 to 40 days, we'll have a more complete proposal. We have been talking and looking at what the different RTOs are doing. I feel like a lot of them concede that we've taken a step. We may need more steps, and we're planning to take a step like that, and we may need more steps, but we feel like a bias towards action is needed here instead of kind of waiting for everyone to figure out the perfect answer.
Great, thank you. That kind of relates to my next question, which is for the full panel. I think there's general consensus that it's necessary to do something about the generator interconnection queue. Broadly speaking, do you feel that the reforms go far enough, or do you think this is the first step and significantly more is needed to fix the problem? Cynthia, want to start with you?
Sure. I think from the robust response that FERC has received, they are doing a great job of getting that conversation going. But also, we know that the system is changing, and to get to this big transformation, it's going to happen in steps, and we're going to learn more things, and we're going to need additional reforms down the road. So I think what they're doing now is great. It's operational today, and they'll sift through their thousands of pages and come up with some good rulings. But one of the things that DOE can help with is that long-term thinking and how what might be the next steps, and how can we help inform those next steps, because nothing's static.
Right.
It's going to have to keep changing.
For sure. Tristan, thoughts?
Do you want to tell me about whether we do something?
Okay, you can have the last word.
Yeah,
How about that?
Okay, there you go.
Okay, so all of our comments are public, and so I can try to relay some of it. I think a lot of things in the NOPE or how FERC set it up are spot on for sure, and go at the foundations of reforms that have fueled us for a while in MISO. There are areas that we think maybe we'd like to see go farther. There's some areas we're a little concerned that may not really help with efficiency or may cause unnecessary work. But at the same time, when I say that, I recognize that every region is so different in terms of their starting point here and where they're at, and the FERC's trying to help us, campaign the whole nation to sort of a different way of living here on Q. So, with that in mind, from MISO's perspective, we outlined concerns in our comments about, is FERC going far enough? Well, they definitely propose things related to, very definitive penalties and things that we wouldn't say, don't go further on those. In fact, we express concerns that we feel like some of those could make things worse and don't get at the root cause of the issue. Things about compliance reporting procedures related to the queue, maybe not really highly valuable, especially for folks who have taken action to address issues. Let's not saddle necessarily those folks who are just trying to process queues that have been improved a lot necessarily to have a lot of compliance. We're maybe going, have they gone far enough, allowing a lot of changes mid-cycle, related to adding storage or something like that. That could cause, we think, a lot of concerns that we think need to be addressed. We're not sure, even though that looks like flexible and adaptable, it also can upset the purpose of doing these queue studies in the first place. And so we have some concerns on those things. So there are some things I think we're concerned maybe, don't need to be accelerated or full down on every RTO the same. Recognize the regions, what they've done with their stakeholders. Other things that could go farther, obviously everything related to first ready, first serve in RTOs and in affected system studies, that policy needs to be the rule, not the exception. That maybe affected system parties may work that out. They need to work it out. Don't have a prescription for how all of those should work out. We're trying to do some things with SPP right now, and we're also talking to the PJM about similar things. So those are some comments at a high level. That said, I've been in the job 6 months. It's a little longer than 4 days, as was mentioned earlier, but let's go for it.
So there you go, folks. You heard from my side. I don't have anything else to say. We're doing a great job. So I think that it's definitely not the end of the process for us, but I think Scott, you laid it out really well, that what we are trying to do here is writing changes to the pro forma. A lot of transmission providers have come to us and proposed other changes that they've done, and I think the Commission is generally supportive of that. There's a different sort of standard of what we can do in a 206 rulemaking versus what a transmission provider can come to us in a 205 filing. So I think that to the extent that we're trying to establish best practices here and transmission providers have moved beyond those practices, that's great. That's why we have a compliance in terms of what specific things might or might not work for different regions based on how many states they have and their markets and non-markets and that kind of stuff. That's why we have the compliance process. But I think that we are trying to establish these best practices and have been encouraged by the work that the transmission providers under the JTIQ on affected systems. I think that's great. We're looking forward to, I think they're trying to finalize exactly where the money goes. We've seen a few meetings with the MISO stakeholders on that. That's the big question, right, is who pays for it. So they're coming up with a proposal. We'll evaluate when we get there, but we think that sort of enhanced coordination of affected systems. We're proposing in the NOPR some sort of basic stuff, right? A pro forma document study process and a construction agreement. We talked a bit about the modeling standards, but I would say we certainly are optimistic that the way that MISO and SPP are sort of approaching their affected systems issues with bigger consideration. I think that's going to be an important one.
Great, thank you. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. It looks like we have about 8 minutes left. Why don't I go ahead and turn it over to the audience to see if anyone has any questions of our panelists. That's the same mic we've been passing around. It's like a hot potato.
Yeah, that's the bum mic. No question.
So I'll just speak up. Fascinating set of issues. My question really is for both Scott and for Ken. let's assume that you are successful, that we are successful in rationalizing the interconnection process and lots of new renewables come to fruition and come online. It seems like with all that we're talking about, both before and now, the implication is we're going to need a lot of other resources to shore up the increased risk that we're seeing on the system. We're getting to a riskier system, so we'll have more stuff, we're going to have more storage, we're going to have more investment in the grid, and that means more cost. We can talk about the cost allocation. So it's a little bit of a rhetorical question, but do you agree that if we're looking to protect against more risks, we're having a higher, we're taking out an insurance policy, essentially, on protecting against, bad things happening, that we have to pay the premium for that insurance, and it's going to cost more in the future, and possibly significantly more for the resources, and that it might be worth it because of the benefits, but it's going to cost more. And would you agree?
In general, I would agree that there's going to be a lot of cost that comes with our clean energy goals, and a lot of costs that we're not talking about. So I think the key is, how do we minimize that cost? How do we leverage regional diversity? How do we put in strong processes? Like I mentioned, attributes. We don't need every resource to have every attribute, but we need enough when it matters. And so that's really leveraging the value proposition of a large regional optimization, is that instead of every member covering their load for those extreme situations on their own and investing full tilt, maybe they only have to bring 80% of what they would have otherwise, or 75% or something. That's what we've got to get figured out. But I do think there will be more cost. Another thing I just say is that, that the risk I'm talking about and the changing risk profile are probably not going to be addressed by peak shaving a few hours here or there with some nifty new load control or flexible load. It's probably not going to be covered by stringing up 4-hour batteries, especially when the nameplate of a solar unit is 200 megawatts and they're going to put in storage for 20, maybe 40. Okay. I just think these are things that we're going to have to confront when we really get the math figured out here, and it is a math problem and an evolution of how we look at the math to be able to size these things up. That there will be more costs, but I think we can find out ways to do it more cost effectively and minimize it and create those benefits and those flows that the customers want.
So I agree that the risk appetite hasn't changed, right? People still want the power to be just as reliable as it always has been. And so you're not going to get a whole lot of give from that. So we need to figure out, I agree, balancing and coordinating would be great. It will minimize, but it's still going to be more costly. And in my opinion, that's okay, because you're going to get the benefits as a result.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Well, great. I really, really appreciated the presentations. We learned a lot. I think, again, this is an extremely critical issue as we look to integrate renewables and meet our carbon-free goals. So, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.